World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and aboard Flight 93 that crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Channeling their grief into action, Mary Fetchet and the late Beverly Eckert established Voices of September 11th. Drawing upon her professional background as a clinical social worker and first-hand experience as a mother of a victim, Mary recognized the challenges families faced in accessing information. Through Voices, she was committed to provide the support that families needed and deserved to help them heal and build resilience in their lives. As a victim's advocate, Mary became a subject matter expert in intelligence reform. Working alongside other families, she met with elected officials, held vigils, press conferences, and testified before Congress. Their advocacy efforts championed the establishment of the 9/11 Commission that led to sweeping intelligence reforms to ensure a safer country. Social work practices and a commitment to providing continuity of care permeates Voices' work. The organization pioneered a wide array of programs, including over 180,000 hours of social service support, hundreds of workshops, webinars, trainings, and symposiums. Voices established weekly teleconference support groups that connected 9/11 families living around the world. Voices staff was integral in assisting thousands of responders and survivors suffering from 9/11-related illnesses, applying for medical and mental health treatment through the World Trade Center Health Program. The 9/11 Living Memorial Project was created to help families commemorate the 2,977 lives lost and document stories of survivors. Voices staff provided the emotional support they needed to select photographs and personal mementos to memorialize their loved one in a meaningful way. Today, the Living Memorial is a core component of the In Memoriam exhibit at the 9/11 Memorial Museum. Voices has become a trusted international advocate and is honored to work with their partners to champion victim services and victims' rights. Through long-standing public-private partnerships with like-minded subject matter experts and professional organizations, Voices assists communities impacted by mass violence, such as Parkland, Newtown, and Charleston. Voices Center for Resilience was built on the foundation of lessons learned while providing long-term support for the 9/11 community. Today, Voices is an internationally recognized nonprofit organization, sharing resources to help individuals and communities heal and build resilience. With your help, Voices' legacy will live on through support services, innovative programs, and the expansion of the Wolf-Gruber Institute Digital Resource Library. Along with their national and international partners, Voices strives to promote mental health care and wellness for all those impacted by tragedy in the United States and abroad.
Hopefully you enjoyed that video. Every time I see it, I want to catch my breath after 2 decades of being what we've all worked with together. The next part of our agenda has become a tradition for our symposium, and that's the candle lighting ceremony. And the candle lighting, when you think about light and the importance of light, when all the darkness hit us on 9/11, I can't think of a darker time in my life. I think light giving us hope, and the fact that I remember at my desk at my office, I kept a candle burning for literally months during the working day as a way of changing the darkness. And I think about the Bible saying moving from darkness to light. And so we, as you know, do a candle lighting ceremony where we take one candle for each year. So we've got 20 candles that get lit with a meaning attached to each of those. And lighting the candles today, we've done it a little bit differently. We actually video recorded a whole group of family members, responders, folks that have been involved with 9/11 since day one. So we're going to show that recording, and Jean Marie Hargrave and her husband, Tom Kearns, are going to be the official lighters as we go through it. So let's take a look at the video with the candle lighting.
As we gather on this 20th anniversary year, we light these 20 candles for 20 years since 9/11, 2001. to commemorate the lives of our loved ones and to honor the dignity, courage, resilience, and unwavering spirit of the families, friends, rescue workers, and survivors, and all those who were affected by the tragedy.
Commemoration. This candle represents commemoration. On this 20th anniversary of the September 11th attacks, the words of poet Thomas Campbell come to mind. To live in hearts we leave behind is not to die.
Faith. This candle represents faith. We thank those from around the world who pray for our families and our country. We thank our religious leaders for providing spiritual guidance and support. Our faith, family, and friends continue as enablers toward continued strength and resilience.
Love. This candle represents love, the everlasting love that we will always carry in our hearts for our loved ones and for each other.
Family. This candle represents the bond of family, the connection we share during good times and bad. It sustains us over time. Our shared experience on and since 9/11 binds us as one.
Friendship. This candle represents friendship. We are thankful for the unwavering bond of friendship, both long-standing friendships that have enriched our lives, as well as friendships developed in the days, months, and years following 9/11. Friendship is our blessing.
Community. This candle honors our communities. We light this candle to celebrate our communities. As Marianne Williamson said, in every community there is much work to be done. In every nation there are wounds to heal. In every heart there is the power to do it.
Healing. This candle represents healing. We light this candle for all within the 9/11 community who've been on a healing journey for the past 20 years. We particularly wish for healing for the responders and survivors, many of whom are suffering from serious medical and mental health conditions, a result of their selflessness and responding to the attacks.
Courage. This candle represents courage. The courage of the brave responders on 9/11 and today's men and women who serve in the military and courageously risk their lives to protect our freedom. May they return safely to their families. As Winston Churchill remarked, courage is rightly esteemed the first of human qualities, because it is the quality which guarantees all others.
Gratitude. This candle represents our gratitude for the support that friends, family, and strangers provided to our families through their thoughtful deeds and heartfelt generosity. So many stepped forward to help in so many varied ways, and often simply to listen and offer hope.
Charity. This candle represents charity. Truly, we have witnessed firsthand the generosity and helpfulness for all impacted in our time of need. Your acts of charity were done without expecting something in return. In the words of Mother Teresa, it is not how much we give, but how much love we put into giving. You gave us love.
Compassion. We light this candle to represent compassion, both the compassion shown to those suffering as well as our personal capacity to show compassion to others. Compassion is our way to suffer together, to feel what others are feeling, and to help confront the suffering.
Peace. This candle represents peace. We pray for peace in our hearts and in our lives. We pray for our leaders, both here in the United States and abroad, to continue to work together toward world peace. We must strive for peace.
Hope. This candle represents hope. Hope for the future of our families, our communities, our nation, and our world. As Desmond Tutu stated, hope is being able to see that there is light despite all the darkness.
Advocacy. This candle is for the incredible advocacy work done by those who have advocated for health benefits and compensation for those impacted by 9/11, and the thousands of caregivers who have compassionately cared for those who have suffered from medical and mental health conditions, including the pandemic.
Kindness. This candle represents every act of kindness, large and small, that has been shown to the families of those who have been touched by 9/11 from around the world. The friendly and considerate support from so many helped all of us through our time of need.
Resilience. This candle we light to celebrate resilience, the power of the human spirit and personal strength demonstrated by so many have provided us with a pathway to hope and recovery. We should be proud of our personal growth and the resilience we've all built.
Tolerance. This candle represents tolerance. At this challenging time, may this candle illuminate the importance of personal and group tolerance and sympathy or indulgence for beliefs, opinions, or practices differing from or conflicting with one's own.
This candle represents optimism. We look ahead to the future with hope, confidence. Now that 2 decades have passed, our optimism reflects the satisfaction of personally growing these past 20 years and is strengthened through our growing resilience.
Remembrance. This candle we light in remembrance of the 2,977 lives lost on September 11th, 2001, and the 4,700 responders and survivors who have died of 9/11 related illnesses since. We also honor the lives of the thousands of individuals who have died of other acts of mass violence and those who have perished since the outbreak of the pandemic. We cherish the special place in our hearts that will always be reserved for them. We thank them for the gift that their lives brought to us. There are special people in our lives who never leave us, even after they are gone.
Well, thank you, Jean Marie and Tom, and thank you for everybody that was part of that recording. As we do each year, we'll leave these candles burning throughout the entire day as the symbol of moving into the light. So with that, before I turn it over to Mary, I want to be sure to thank our sponsors. And if the technology cooperates, I got the agenda. There we go. First off, we have the different tiering like everybody does as they sponsor events. And at the highest levels, the 20th anniversary Resilience sponsor, Turkin Heath and Macaulay and Deary Law really stepped up to help us. So could you give them a round of applause at the highest level? Matt even had us go to the NYPD and fire department hockey game last night, which was a lot of fun in the garden. From a legacy sponsor level, FT Cares, Fairfield County's Community Foundation. FT Cares is First Trust out of Chicago. They've been really helpful. Fairfield County, of course, we live in Fairfield County in Connecticut, and that's a wonderful community foundation. Remembrance sponsors, Goldman Sachs, Kreinler & Kreinler, and TPICAP, who also has volunteers with us today. Presenting sponsors, Barish and McGarry, Motley Rice, and Spicer Krause. Let's give them all a round of applause.
Thanks, Frank. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Mary Fetchet, and on behalf of the entire Voices team, I want to thank you for joining us today. For those of you who were here yesterday, whether you were here in person or online, I want to welcome you back, and then also welcome those who are joining us for the first time today. Remembrance, reflection, and resilience is the theme of Voice's 20th Anniversary Remembrance Symposium as we commemorate this important milestone. Although the 20th anniversary recalls a day that changed the lives of so many, it's a time to remember the legacy of those lost, reflect on our accomplishments and our journey together, and to celebrate the resilience that has been demonstrated by the 9/11 community and those who have stepped forward to help. The symposium is a compilation of our work and advocacy efforts and the many remarkable individuals we've had the privilege of working with over the last 20 years, many of our special guests here today. Yesterday, we heard the inspiring stories from individuals who, in the face of great tragedy, did what they do best, demonstrating the resilience and the strength of the human spirit. Journalists reflected on how they faced the unimaginable task of reporting on the tragedy at Ground Zero, how they documented the stories of the lives that were lost, and followed the myriad of complex issues that many of us were intimately involved in advocating for. We relied on their reports as a source of information, and they played a crucial role in educating the American public about the issues still today. We heard the extraordinary story of two Green Berets in the aftermath of the attacks, who bravely were among the first to arrive in Afghanistan on horseback yet. And I think they mentioned only one of them really had any expertise in riding horses, and I think there were a dozen of them. But they really had their valiant efforts to go into uncharted territory and build the coalitions that they talked about yesterday. Three of my favorite U.S. representatives, Jane Harman, Christopher Shays, and I'm sorry, I'm having a blank here, and Tim Romer were here with us yesterday. And it's much like today, a reunion among those of us that worked to make sure that there was a bipartisan effort to build a congressional coalition and work with the 9/11 families to ensure the 9/11 Commission was established and to implement its reforms. Family members, survivors, and responders shared their stories, many struggling with serious medical conditions and losing friends and family members due to the 9/11 related illnesses. Their resilience and ongoing efforts to help others inspired all of us to face our challenges and appreciate every day, a message that was reiterated by the presentation of a trauma expert. Artists shared their stories on how they used their artistic talents to create artwork to provide hope and healing for the 9/11 families and to document the response in the aftermath of 9/11. And if you have a chance, when you're walking through the hallways, it's actually a small sample of an art exhibit that we have on display in Connecticut today. So today we have another very full agenda, and we want to thank all of our special guests that are here with us today to provide their insights, their expertise, and their reflections. Before we move into the program, just a couple of housekeeping items. Number one, I heard a few phones go off already this morning, so if you could turn off your phones, that would be great. And I think when we were planning the conference, we really weren't sure, well, none of us are sure about what were, the COVID guidelines. And so thank you to each of you for showing your record of vaccination, and we were told when we arrived that you're welcome to use a mask, but also if you feel comfortable without one, you're welcome to do that as well. The restrooms are right across the hallway here. There's actually plenty of exit signs right here in the room. And, we had the information up if you use social media, as many of you do, including Susan Collins, by the way. I'm following you on social media. Be sure to post, on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, to really promote some of the wonderful information that's going to be shared today. And of course, if you need any assistance at all, our staff is out in the hallway and is happy to help you. I can't, for some reason, I can't advance this. No? Okay. Well, I believe each of you have a schedule, and what we're going to be doing is starting with Sites of Memory. We're just waiting for the last panelist to arrive, and so we have a few minutes here, and I thought I'd like to introduce the chair of our board, Bonnie McNamara, who lost her husband, Eamon, who was working on at Cantor Fitzgerald that day. And she's been a really critical and important person on our board. And as I said, she's the chair of our board. Bonnie, do you want to come up and say a few words?
Thank you, Mary. Good morning, and of course, welcome to the second day of the Voices Symposium. As Mary said, I'm Bonnie McNamara, a lot of Irish there, chair of the Voices Board. It's very difficult to imagine that 20 years have gone by since September 11th. My husband, as Mary said, Eamon McEnany, was on the 105th floor of the North Tower working for Cantor Fitzgerald. So I appreciate everything that you are going through with this anniversary. Like you, I couldn't imagine that today, September 10th, 20 years ago, any of us would have our entire lives changed in a 24-hour period. It's just simply amazing. But what I do know is the 9/11 community is a resilient one. It has tremendous, tremendous resolve. And as so many have acknowledged, the attacks were intended to break our spirit, but I think collectively we are stronger. Every year we get stronger. Voices of September 11th, now Voices Center for Resilience, has been dedicated over these 20 years to being an information resource while providing mental health and other support to the 9/11 community. And under the leadership of Mary and Frank Fetchet, the organization continues with that mission and shares the learnings with other communities exposed to mass violence. These unique learnings gained from our work with the 9/11 families, first responders, and survivors have enabled the development of the many programs and general support that is the legacy of Voices. Thank you for joining us today, and my thoughts are with you and your families during this difficult time. Thank you.
And just to, because we have a few minutes, I believe, just to, elaborate a little bit more on what Bonnie was saying. In 2007, of course, we have provided upwards of 200,000 hours of social service support over the years. We've held over 2,200 support groups. The families lived in 93 countries, so we had to think creatively on how they were going to connect with each other. So we actually used teleconference groups. Now enter Zoom. Wow, I was able to turn on my heels quickly and say, wow, I wanted this for 18 years now. Welcome. And so that really enhanced our program. So when COVID hit, as difficult as it was, it really helped us move our programs forward in a way that we wouldn't have been able to do. And so we, as I mentioned, started in 2007 when the Virginia Tech shooting happened. We recognized that the same mistakes were being made time and time again in these acts of mass violence. And so we started doing some research. We went to Oklahoma City, Virginia Tech, Northern Illinois University, Tucson, Arizona, where the Gabby Gifford shooting occurred. And we probably have a room full of after-action reports from 9/11. That led to us to putting together a resource kit because we really felt to be proactive after these tragedies really is in the best interest of the people that are impacted. We also realized that it was well beyond the victims' families, and as you can see, today, there were over 400,000 people that survived the attacks on 9/11. So they lived, worked, or went to school in the area. And then over 90,000 people that responded. 83,000 are currently in treatment. What we've found is people are resilient, but they still need support. And that was really apparent and demonstrated, so articulately yesterday with a panel of the families, responders, and survivors. So I believe, much like the Holocaust, there are going to be intergenerational issues, and we're always also seeing that. But that said, we're looking at the best practices. We've created tip sheets that have been distributed worldwide. We're part of an international network, and that work continues today to try to help these communities prepare for, but if they're not prepared, to help them respond. And really, the 9/11 community has taught us so much in our work with them and about trauma and grief and strength and resilience. And so it's really due to what we're hearing from you, what your ongoing needs are, where you're willing to share with us, and the conversations that we still hear today in the support groups, the writing workshops, and the other programs that we're providing. So I see that Governor Pataki arrived, and so I think we'll go to our next panel. Alice, Anthony, Governor Pataki, if you'd like to come up. The 9/11 Memorial, they have done just a magnificent job in creating a memorial that is honoring the lives that were lost. It's telling the story of 9/11, and it's also sharing the resilience and the good that came out of a very tragic event. So we decided it was really important to have a panel to talk about the memorial from its infancy when the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation was formed to redevelop Lower Manhattan, under the guidance of Governor Pataki. And then as the process continued under the guidance of Alice Greenwald. Governor Pataki was the 53rd governor of the state of New York. He was elected to his first term, taking office in January of 1995, re-elected for a second term by over 1 million votes. Wow. And re-elected to a third term by almost 3/4 of the 1 million votes, which says something about the job he was doing. Governor Pataki led New York through the September 11th attacks and their aftermath, and oversaw the rebuilding of Lower Manhattan with award-winning memorial. We also have Alice Greenwald. And Alice Greenwald is the president and chief executive of the 9/11 Memorial Museum. Alice has been the director of the museum since 2006, and she's responsible for the museum that tells the story of September 11, 2001, and February 26, 1993, the bombing that occurred then. She's in charge of developing programming, preparing exhibits, choosing artifacts, designing educational components, organizing and coordinating all of the operational details of the museum. And before Alice joined the museum in New York City, she served as Associate Museum Director for Museum Programs for the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. And then we have Anthony Gardner. Anthony, we figured out he could have been my son on 9/11. He was about the age of my son that died on 9/11. And it's funny because my middle name is Ann, which I never use. So my email is M.A. Fetchet. He gave me the nickname of Ma Fetchet, and a lot of people have picked that up, and I call him Ant. Anthony is a public administration professional who has worked on 9/11 related issues since 2001. We'll be sharing some images of that in honor of his Brother Harvey, who was killed in the terrorist attacks. He founded the September 11th Educational Trust, World Trade Center United Family Group in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. And I do have a funny story. Anthony, I think, was working in PR or something, and he used to go to work, open his briefcase, and then he'd go off and go to meetings. They never knew that he was gone for the day. So, but he was really instrumental in the Section 106 process that declared the site the historical preservation as far as the footprints of the building and so forth. So I'm going to join the panel, and I'm going to turn it over to Anthony to moderate.
Well, thank you, Ma Fetchet. Good morning, everyone. And it's hard to believe, as coming in this morning. It's been a whole year since I've been to the World Trade Center site, to the memorial, and walking by the memorial today, I was just struck by this feeling of feeling at home, if you will. This place is a part of who I am. It's a part of our country's very fabric, and it's sacred ground. And 20 years later, to be able to sit up here and have the opportunity to reflect on its importance, the role that we each played in its creation is truly humbling, and I'm grateful for the opportunity. I'm grateful to Ma to ask me to also moderate this discussion for us. So I'll do my best. This is my first panel that I've ever moderated, so there's a little disclaimer there. So if it goes off the rails, I apologize. I blame Mary. But we thought we would start, Governor Pataki, with you. I mean, being the governor of the state that was at the epicenter of these attacks that morning, can you talk about your experience that day and then touch on when it shifted from that sort of emergency response mode to beginning to think about memorialization and what steps you took to pave the way for that process?
Well, Anthony, sure, I could speak the whole hour to do that. I will do my best not to. But I first just want to thank you, thank Mary, thank all the voices, because I get asked all the time, how did you get through this? And it's emotional for me. But the answer of how I got through it was you. I took strength from the family members. We all lost friends and people we worked with. And we still suffer 20 years later because of that. But it's nothing compared to losing your brother or your son or your wife or your daughter. The tragedy that you, the family members, have gone through is something that, to me, always was a magnitude above what our sense of loss could ever be. And your strength, and I mean this in absolute sincerity, is what helped me get through those days thereafter, because whenever I felt weak, I would get a hug from a family member. Not Anthony usually, but I get a hug. I get a hug from a family member. So that's and that strength helped me be able to lead through this entire crisis. So first I have to thank all of you. That morning I was in the city, which is unusual. I'm an upstate guy, which is why I was hoping I'd make it by 9:30 this morning. But I had stayed in the city. And my daughter was working at Bloomberg News, and she called me and said, "Dad, turn on the TV." And I saw that a plane had hit the tower, and she was rattled. And I was reassuring her it was probably just a horrible mistake, and then I saw the second plane, and like everybody else, knew that we were being attacked. And so I had had a lot of experience, sadly, dealing with tragedies and emergencies, so I knew we just had to immediately spring into action. And I called up my emergency team, activated the emergency command center, called up the National Guard. And what people don't realize today was the uncertainty as to whether there'd be more attacks. And we had to be very actively aware that this could be the beginning of something bigger. So I signed a lot of orders to shut down the bridges and tunnels. And then I talked to Mayor Giuliani that morning, told him I was in the city, that we were calling up our emergency team. We would be there to do whatever the city needed to get through this. I called up President Bush, talked to him at the Education Summit to ask him to shut down the airspace over New York, and he said, "I've already shut down the airspace over America." And that later that day I couldn't speak to Mayor Giuliani because the buildings came down and he was trapped in the rubble. But I was able to talk to President Bush through most of the day, and then eventually that afternoon with Mayor Giuliani. But I don't want to get to the second part because I don't want to monopolize the discussion too much, Anthony. But that afternoon, I got a call from Rudy that he was okay and that he had moved and set up a temporary command center at the old police academy in Lower Manhattan. And I thought for a minute, and at that moment, I made the most important decision I made in 12 years as governor. I thought for a minute, and then I said, I'll be right down. And I took all my emergency team, and we went down to Giuliani's command center, and we went into the same room, sat at the same table. And that afternoon, and for weeks and months thereafter, we were at the same table in the same room. The mayor, myself, all of my key emergency players, all of his key emergency players. So we never had a miscommunication. Well, I thought you were going to do this, or you were supposed to do that. We had a response that was seamless. And that evening, FEMA came in, and they sat at that same table. So I think back on things like Katrina, where the city blamed the state, and the state blamed the feds, and the feds blamed the city. We didn't have any of that. We could not have had any of that because of the magnitude of the tragedy. And that, to me, to this day, I still think my decision to take my whole team to the city's command center and allowing that seamless response was absolutely critical. And Anthony, I'll cut it off there. I know you want to talk about how we decided to move on, and I'm happy to do that, but the other panelists deserve a chance to speak here as well.
Well, thank you, and thank you for your leadership on that day and the years after as well.
Thank you.
Let's actually ask Mary if you could just talk a little bit about how you first got involved in the memorial efforts.
Well, I realized, I don't know if is my mic on? No. There it is, okay. I realized living in Connecticut, all of the decisions were being made in New York. I really felt out of place being in Connecticut. I started going into the Family Assistance Center, and that was really a comforting place for me to be with other families, to hear their stories, to be able to connect with them. And then we started going into meetings in New York City. I remember meeting, I don't know how I ended up there, but Hillary Clinton's office, I think there were 3 of us at the time. And through those meetings, I became, come to know the other family members like Anthony. And we realized that you had the task not just to respond and work in the recovery effort, but you also had to communicate with the families. And when you think back to 2001, people didn't use the internet. They really didn't. Some of them didn't have cell phones, or we really had to rely on the news, which was reporting on things that happened. And I felt that it was important as a family member to be part of that process. And to be able to not just tell from my viewpoint, but from the viewpoint of the other families that I was meeting with in Connecticut. So that's really where I met Anthony, and then I ended up on the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation Advisory Committee for many years. You know, it was a long and arduous process, but that's how it is when you are responding to, you know, a tragedy beyond anyone's imagination. And so I appreciate being part of that process.
Let's spend just a few more minutes on sort of those early days and that early start of the process. Can you talk to us, Governor Pataki, about was there a particular model or something that you and your team looked towards for guidance on how to even begin this process to memorialize an event of such enormity that was so sensitive and so emotionally charged for thousands of people?
You know, Anthony, I wish there had been a model, but I don't think there was. This was just something that certainly in all of our lives is unique, and I think in most of our history is unique. So we didn't have a model, but one thing I did have is I had experience. And if you remember the TWA Flight 800 crash, that was one of the disasters that I had to deal with. And those days one of the things that struck me was when I got there, the families were completely lost. They had nowhere to go. They had no way to get information. They were just wandering around in small groups begging to find out what information we had. And so we actually ultimately set up a few rooms at the hotel near where the flight had taken off as to help the families. But when September 11th hit, I knew immediately we had to set up a center for the families. That they, for all our loss, they were going to want to have the best information, the support, the help that they needed. So that morning we set up a family center at the Armory in Lower Manhattan. And it was just so moving that so many family members were there with the signs and begging for information about their loved ones. And then later on in the process, I think it was the Red Cross or one of the advisory groups that was helping us said the Armory is too dark. And you want something that's lighter, so we moved to the pier on the west side. But I had that experience with TWA 800 and knew we needed to have a special center for those who had lost so much. But when it came to the rebuilding, we were starting from scratch, and it was a difficult process. Initially, you probably remember, the Port Authority, which controlled the site, said, well, we're just going to build offices. And they actually had a planning team come up with the offices. And as soon as I saw it, and I'm sure many of you, we just thought it was ridiculous. This is hallowed ground. You can't just rebuild offices over the space where so many wonderful people were killed that morning. So then the key to me was to have a public process. I wasn't going to be the dictator who decides how this is going to be done. So we had this inclusive process where we reached out to architects from around the world to create a master site plan. I didn't want to just do one building or one thing. We wanted to have a master site plan. And that was absolutely essential. And through the LMDC, we had funding, so we narrowed it down from the hundreds to a handful of 5. And we gave them a few $100,000 to do detailed models of what the master site plan would look at. And then we put them in the Winter Garden at the World Financial Center. And I'm sure, Anthony, you know all this, and many of you do too. But we put it on the internet, and there were over 10 million hits on the internet, even though it was in its just beginning, with people expressing their opinion. And so then ultimately, I had left it to the LMDC to make the decision. And I don't want to keep going on too much, but this is really important. And I saw the plans, obviously. I met with the architects, and I thought the Libeskind plan was by far the best. And I thought the Vignoli plan was by far the worst. So the morning that the LMDC is going to vote, I get a call from a friend and goes, well, I guess it's going to be Vignoli. And I go, what do you mean? And he goes, look at the front page of the New York Times. So I read the front page of the New York Times, and it says LMDC, which I had designated to choose the plan, has decided to go with a Vignoli plan, and they be voting later that morning, anonymous sources said. And I knew right away who the anonymous sources were. And that morning, Mike Bloomberg and I were going to meet with the LMDC and the architects, the finalists, to come in. So I called up Mike and I said, have you agreed that the Vignoli plan is the right plan? And he said, no. And I said, well, I think it's awful. I think we got to do Libeskind. So we go down to the meeting, and the Vignoli team comes in, and they're arrogant as can be. I ask them things like, has anything like this ever been built? No. Do you have any idea how long it'll take? No. And it was just a hideous, hideous thing. And then Libeskind came in, and he preserved the core for the memorial to me, which was absolutely essential. And then he had the building spiraling up, the transportation hub, and I just thought it was a brilliant plan. So the LMDC had decided to go the other way, and finally they left, and I talked to the LMDC, and I said, you can't do this. You cannot choose that plan. This is much better. And Mike Bloomberg chimes in, and he goes, because the Vignoli plan was 2 like skeletons where the towers had stood, and I'll never forget this. He goes, we just paid $30 million to tear down 2 abandoned fuel tanks in Queens that look exactly like the Vignoli plan. And between the two of us, the LMDC, they finally said, they didn't say it, but they voted after Mike and I left. They voted for the Liebeskin plan, and then they all resigned. And I give them credit because they knew ultimately I'd get the blame if it had been a bad plan. And they finally said, this is what they want, we'll do it. It's not what we want, so we'll step aside after. And I give them credit for that they actually did what we thought. So anyway, then we had the master site plan. And that was the key to the whole thing, was having this concept. And then the next step was, what are we going to do about a memorial?
Right.
Can I say too, Anthony, I think for the families, it is sacred ground. There's still 1,100 families that have never been notified of the remains. So for those families, for all of us, but in particular those families, that is their grave site. But the families, and Anthony, I think you should be talking about some of your advocacy efforts, but we wanted water to drown out the sound of the city. We wanted to be able to touch the names that were around the footprints of the building. We wanted them to be around the space where they once worked and where they died. We wanted the survivor staircase to be incorporated. We wanted the slurry wall to be incorporated. I mean, that was a magnificent story, because if that wall had cracked, all of Lower Manhattan would have been flooded. So that's a story in and of itself. And we wanted the faces and the names to be seen. And that's really where we stepped in 2005 to create the Living Memorial and to meet with the families one-on-one. And we collected over 87,000 photographs of the victims. We used social work practices. We weren't archivists, and I remember meeting with Dr. Billington, who is the 13th Librarian of Congress, which was like Greek to me. What does the Librarian of Congress do? So we met with him, and it was like seeing the Pope. We were staged and briefed before Frank was with me. And we got into his office. He's the most lovely, Dr. Billington, the most lovely, gentle man. And I told him what we wanted to do, and he just put his hands to his head and he said, you don't understand that you are cutting edge. There are no standards for what you want to do. And could you imagine if someone like you did this during the Civil War, the stories that we would have collected? And I thought, cutting edge, what's he talking about? We're going to scan photographs, we're going to put them on the website. And of course, we had no limitations to the number of photographs for these families. But I do think now, because I said to him, I see these similarities, that they went to the same school, they graduated from the same college, they played a certain sport, whatever it was. And I thought if we could put in a keyword and we'd be able to come up with all the people that went to Bucknell University or whatever, lived in a certain community. Well, that was before Google. So now when I think back, I guess we were cutting edge. But it didn't stop us from doing the work. And I remember, Alice, when you came on board, I'd bring those books in and say, you can't believe what these families are sharing with us. And of course, it was before smart boards, so there was an evolution there in the museum as well.
So I think before we move on to talk about Alice's entree into this in 2006, I believe, when you became director, just some personal reflections, some of the things you were saying, Governor Pataki. One of the standout moments for me in the early years was when the Port Authority had released a plan to, they actually put public their intention to build a bus depot on the site. And essentially it would have been on the footprints of the towers. And I know Mary touched upon this in her remarks, but for those of you here who are community members and those of you who remember those early years, in those early years, there was that massive construction ramp that fed down 70 feet into the bedrock of the site. And this was the lowest level of the site. It was part of that annual remembrance pilgrimage, if you will. We would all journey down to bedrock. And I know there's some images that you'll see in that scroll that of individuals who are family members who are at bedrock, and you see the emotion there was a tangible connection there to our loved ones. You know, for many of us, we viewed the footprints of the towers. I mean, this was a massive 16-acre site. 1.8 million tons of debris was removed from it during the 9-month recovery operation. The scale of it was enormous. And so what we did early on was sort of hone in on the footprints of the towers as sort of this demarcation of sacred ground. And we learned and thankfully with Governor Pataki's help, he quickly shot that plan down because he heard our outcry loud and clear and our objections to it. And I'll never forget you said that we will never build where the tower stood. Where the tower stood is sacred ground. American heroes died there just like American heroes died at Gettysburg. And we really took that and ran for the next few years, because even with the Libeskind plan, you know, this is a site that was 16 acres of prime New York real estate, a lot of competing interests, a lot of interest in restoring the commercial aspect of it. And so what we really were working to do was sort of find that balance between the importance of preserving sacred ground and then realizing helping to spur the revitalization of Lower Manhattan. So we would often then refer to the site and in those terms, comparing it to Gettysburg, comparing the footprints, the remnants of the towers to the strafing marks in the concrete at Pearl Harbor. And it was effective, I think, in helping the public to understand what was there. So in those early years, from the Libeskind design to Michael Arad's reflecting absence that was selected as a result of an international design competition, over 5,000 entries from around the world. When that design was selected, I think many of our family members who were advocating for the preservation of the footprints, as we said at the time, from bedrock to infinity, we were glad to see that design, but we were also sort of guarded because there wasn't any discussion about, there was a recognition of the footprints by the pools, right, at street level, but what about the actual archaeological remnants of the towers that were anchored 70 feet below those symbolic voids? And so the next few years, Governor Pataki, when you brought about when you brought Frank Siami in to do sort of a reassessment, can you just briefly talk about that and how that then ensured the preservation of the towers because of some of the modifications that he made? And then we'll move on to Alice to talk about the memorial and the museum planning efforts.
Yeah, well, it's one thing to have another plan, it's another thing to build the plan. And we had the plan, and then how are we going to do it? And it was extremely difficult. As you mentioned, it's 7 stories underground, and you're talking about the slurry wall, and it had stood, but when we're building, are we going to disrupt it? Is it possibly going to break? We had the subway tracks, we had the PATH train, and rebuilding it was just an enormous challenge that I don't think that certainly the press didn't understand, but you had to do it right. And so we had all the different builders come in and Silverstein and everything, and it looked okay, but there was no coherency. So you're absolutely right that getting Frank Siami to come in and take a fresh look, and he had no dog in the hunt. He didn't have any rights to build a building or anything. He could take a fresh look from an expert standpoint and see how we could bring this all together and actually build it. And he did a tremendous job in helping us to move the actual construction forward. And Anthony's talking about the sacred ground, the footprints, and the memorial wonderfully does that, as you said, from street level. But you go, as everyone knows, you go down to the bottom, and the actual box beams that were the beginning of the construction are exposed and available for people to see. And that was a refinement that came from looking at it freshly and hearing the families and saying, yes, we're going to have this memorial, but we want people to understand actually where the literal footprint of the towers was. So we were able to do that. And just a lot of tremendous people worked very hard to bring this about. And we had the master plan, we had the engineering, we had the ability to move forward. Then we had the hall. We didn't have the memorial, and the museum, I think, was probably the last part to come together. And without that, we wanted to not just show the magnitude of the attacks and the heroism of the response, we wanted to tell the stories of the people. And the only way to do that, I'll leave to Agnes.
All right. So Alice, you come into your role in 2006. Can you talk about what that, when you entered into that scene, what it was like for you, and what were some of the initial observations and challenges that you and your team faced?
Well, I'll tell you what I thought before I came to New York, which is when I got a call from the LMDC to ask me to apply for this job of creating a museum, a memorial museum at Ground Zero. And I was sitting in my office at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. I had been affiliated with them for 19 years. I loved my job. It was the best job in the world. And I said to the person on the other end of the line, no one in their right mind is going to take that job.
That's why they called you.
And I meant it because, you know, all of the controversy at the site with the Freedom Center and literally every decision that was made in those early years blew up into a controversy. And I do remember a colleague of mine, Ed Linenthal, who has written extensively on memorial museums. He said, you know, well, controversy is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just evidence of passion on all sides. And there was more passion to go around than anybody could imagine. So I won't go into why I changed my mind, but I decided to take on the challenge. And honestly...
Oh, you should tell us why.
How much time do you have here?
25 minutes, 44 seconds.
You know, so much work had already been done. And I truly believe the museum as it has come to be could never have emerged was it not for the work of the LMDC, Governor Pataki's leadership, Mary's work with family advocacy, and Frank Siami, whose revisioning of the property of the site actually opened up space for the museum we have today. The original plan for the memorial was actually, I think it had 3 levels and it went all the way down 70 feet. And there was a little space in the ramp going down to the bottom of the memorial, to where the footprints are, that was left to tell the story of the day. And it was insufficient because, by the way, there was a Memorial Center Advisory Committee led by the wonderful Anita Contini, who gathered experts and family members and to come up with a laundry list of everything that needed to be addressed in this museum. And it was 2 pages single-spaced. Every line, I mean, and they handed this to me, literally, when I got to New York, and they said, go to it, you know. And the challenges were legion. You know, you had so many different constituents of this project. You had family members, you had the first response community, you had government agencies, you had landmark preservationists, you had downtown residents who really didn't want to be reminded about what was outside their windows. They just wanted to get back to their lives. You had the commercial real estate people. I mean, we were listening to everyone. And I would have to say that the early phase of imagining what this museum would be was an exercise in hearing equally compatible visions, I mean, equally legitimate visions that were not at all compatible, right? Everybody's point of view was correct, but you couldn't end up with a project that could satisfy all of the expectations. So, Anthony, I know you remember, and Mary, you were a part of it. We began the process of envisioning the museum by simply bringing together as many representatives of those different constituencies as we could. And we started in a room not unlike this one, with 90 people in the room, and they represented all of those various points of view. And the idea was simply, first of all, to come to a common language about what we meant by Memorial Museum and what it was we were trying to achieve. And then second, to just bring the complexities of the issues we were confronting to this larger group and to listen without making a decision right away. So we looked at everything from, you know, how to present traumatic imagery in the space of a public educational museum. what do you do with artifacts that may contain the dust that may contain human remains? Does that belong in a museum? I mean, these were tough questions. And we had to negotiate all of those kinds of sensibility issues with the pressures to maintain what are called the historic assets of the site. There had been the Section 106 process.
Oh, yes.
Remember that?
Yeah, I remember.
Those were intense conversations. And this was about the site, because it had received some federal money through the appropriation from Congress, that actually was what the LMDC was formed to distribute to help rebuild Lower Manhattan. About $250 million of that money went to building a memorial and a museum. And once you receive federal money, you were obligated to comply with federal preservation law. The site, because of the master site plan, because of Daniel Libeskind, who had identified the power of this slurry wall and the other remaining foundational elements of the original World Trade Center, the site became eligible for landmark status. So suddenly we were obligated, and the architects had to contend with this, to create a space that would make meaningfully accessible to the public named historic assets of the site. So the slurry wall, the cut-off tops of the box column remnants, which were the exterior structure of the Twin Towers, the survivor staircase, which was located in the master site plan through the curtain wall of what would have been Tower 2. And so from the architect's point of view, and that was Norman Foster, get rid of it. From the landmark preservationist point of view, that's the last standing remnant of the original World Trade Center, and it became named the 11th most endangered artifact in America by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. So you had all of these opposing pressures that we had to negotiate. And we simply began a process of listening to everyone. And we had something called the Conversation Series. It went on for 8 years. But in the process of these conversations, it's still going. In the process of having these discussions, and some of the people in the room changed over the years, but some were, like Anthony and Mary and Frank, were, stalwart participants to the very end. And we brought in scholars, and we brought in historians, and we brought our design team forward, and they would present these designs. And I do remember, I will share one story because I think it's indicative of the iterative nature of our process. So you heard earlier about the fact that the families had asked to have the unidentified remains under the custody of the medical examiner, the chief medical examiner, the city of New York, that needed to be brought back to the site. That these remains were stored in refrigerated vans across the street from Bellevue in a temporary memorial park. And families wanted a dignified placement for these remains. The medical examiner wanted a repository, not a tomb, because Dr. Hirsch, of blessed memory, made a commitment in perpetuity that the OCME and their staff would try to make positive identifications as long as it was needed. And that's gone on for 20 years. They've used increasingly precise forensic DNA analysis to make positive identifications. There was an article in the paper yesterday that 2 positive identifications were made this week. If you can imagine, 20 years later. So long story short, a coalition of family members petitioned Governor Pataki that these remains needed to come back to the site. Not all family members agree about everything, and there was controversy about that too, but we'll leave that to another conversation. And Governor Pataki made the decision that, in deference to this petition, that the repository would come back to the site. And the families had conditions, Anthony will remember. And the conditions were that the remains should not be on either one of the footprints, because that would privilege one group of victims over the other. And it had to be within what they called the embrace of the slurry wall. Well, there was literally one location in the museum, what would be eventually the museum at Bedrock, between the 2 tower footprints within the embrace of the slurry wall. And as the museum space was being architecturally designed, that location was where visitors would arrive when they got to Bedrock, 70 feet below ground. Not the best place to start your museum experience. So we had the challenge of trying to figure out, first of all, how to be transparent about the presence of human remains on the other side of a wall that you're in a public museum. You've got a private, non-accessible repository. It's owned and operated by the city of New York. It's not part of the museum, but the only way you can get there is to go through the museum. And there is a family reflection room adjacent to it, only accessible to families by appointment with the OCME. But we had the problem of, how do you begin your narrative experience in a museum if the first thing you come to is a wall behind which are the unidentified remains of the victims? It's a hard place to begin a story. We went through many design iterations of that wall. The feeling for the design of the museum was that it needed to be raw. This wasn't going to be a place that had polished granite walls. You're in an archaeological site. We went through many designs, and we brought what we thought was a great design when we had the Virgil quote that is made of the reforged remnant World Trade Center steel. It's very beautiful iridescent blue that came from the refiring of the remnant steel, and that makes the letters. And we put that in a design rendering, and we brought it to the conversation series. And the designers thought, we nailed it. We got this "no day shall erase you from the memory of time," this sense of the transformative beauty of memory in the very body of the letters. And I can remember a family member coming up to me afterward and saying, if my loved one is behind that raw concrete wall, those words are not enough. I need to know there's something dignified for my loved one. And, I don't care what you do, but that's not gonna cut it. And so we had to go back to the drawing board because meeting those expectations were the highest priority for us. That if this did not work for those family members, it wasn't gonna work for anybody. And so we went back and we went through many design iterations, and we finally arrived through a long process with the idea that the only thing that would work in that spot would be art. That it needed to be something that could communicate at a different level than the cerebral. And we went through not a competition, an invitational, and we selected the work of Spencer Finch that I think everyone is familiar with, the big blue wall with the 2,983 individually painted, hand-painted watercolor squares. Each of them is a different shade of blue. Spencer uses a spectrometer to measure light coming out of the hue, and he numbered each one, and each one is completely individual. But it creates a mosaic, a unified field of blue. And his brilliance is that he's communicating that these people, nearly 3,000 human beings, will forever be connected by virtue of the circumstances of their deaths. They're unified in that way, but we can never forget that each was a unique individual. And then he turns it on us, and he titled it "Trying to Remember the Color of the Sky" on that September morning. We all remember that sky. If we were alive that day and living in this country, it was what the aviation industry called severe clear. Mm-hmm. And it was unbelievably beautiful. But my memory of that blue might not be the same as the governor's memory of blue, but we all have the obligation to remember. So we got where we needed to go, but it was not without many steps along the way, a great deal of feedback, and a great deal of raw honesty, frankly, from the participants in this conversation series.
Yeah. Yeah, Alice, I think, thank you for your leadership over the years and for bringing this vision to form and to life. And, one of the things that we said throughout the process was, if this memorial museum didn't resonate with us, the family members, the community members, it's not going to succeed.
That's right.
It's not going to resonate with people. And we see today the millions of people from all walks of life who come to this sacred site. They make the pilgrimage, they pay respects at the memorial, they go inside the museum, they learn the story, and it's transformative for some people. Like literally, people from all walks of life come into this with, made their own understanding of 9/11. We're now teaching a whole new generation that wasn't alive. They don't have a memory of that blue sky that day, right?
That's right.
So Before we...
Can I just add one thing?
Yeah, sure, go ahead. We have one more final question I just want to ask everybody in the last few minutes.
This follows on that blue sky. So tomorrow we are doing something, it's a social media activation, and I'm not great at social media, but I can try to explain what we're doing. We're asking everyone to take a moment tomorrow on the 20th anniversary of 9/11 to look up and take a picture with your cell phone and post it to Instagram if you're on Instagram with the hashtag never forget. And can you imagine if people all around the world, doesn't matter what the sky looks like tomorrow, if it's rainy, if it's cloudy, if it's clear blue, but we're all looking up. And we spoke to Spencer Finch about this just to make sure he was comfortable with us doing a kind of a social media riff on his magnificent work of art. And he said, you know, I love it. It's inviting active remembrance. So I welcome you all to be a participant in our Remember the Sky activation tomorrow. Just take a minute, look up, and do it together.
So tomorrow we mark the 20th anniversary of these events that changed our lives, our country. And so final question for everyone, if you could just briefly reflect on, you know, these 20 years, and in thinking about the Memorial Museum that we have today here at the hallowed World Trade Center site, does it live up to your expectations and your vision from those early days in the process? Mary, let's start with you.
I think absolutely, and again, I want to applaud, Governor Pataki and Alice for the incredible work that you've done over the years, and what an honor it's been, to work with you. I would say that, it was a long process. In fact, I remember at one meeting saying it was easier to pass sweeping intelligence reform than it was to get, because you were so fast at it. But it required that time. It required the conversation, and it required the debate. And I think that at the end of the day, it met all and more of my expectations. And I think, like Anthony, I feel oddly at home being at the memorial, because it was such a part of our life, and making sure that it came to fruition. And and we're here to support you, in the coming days and the coming years. And one thing I wanted to mention, that in addition to working with the families to document the 2,977 lives that were lost, for the 20th anniversary, we're launching the same project for the responder and survivor families who have lost somebody since. So it's much easier today than it was back then, because we had to carry scanners and computers around, where now people are able to submit photographs digitally. So it's going to be a big project, certainly, not to understate that, but also an important project, because the loss is continuing today, and we want to make sure that we're honoring those individuals as well.
Great. Governor Pataki?
It's a tough question, because nothing should ever meet your expectations. I don't mean to say it, but you should always expect more. But the honest answer is yes, that it has achieved what I had hoped. And what I wanted to do, what I thought we had to do, was honor the families, honor those who died, and tell the story of September 11th in a way where someone who wasn't born then would understand the magnitude of the loss, the courage of how we responded, and the story of each person who died that day. They weren't numbers. They were a person who, those people are still beloved today and will be in memory forever. So we had to do these different things. And when I go there, I think we have. I think people who weren't born can look at the memorial, see the reflecting pools, understand the size of the loss, and then you see the names. So you can understand how many wonderful people died, and then you go to Alice's museum and you hear those stories, you see those stories. So yes, I did. And just yesterday, I was at the memorial and a little girl, 6 or 7, comes up to me. This literally happened just yesterday, and it brings me tears. And somehow she knew that I'd been governor, and she comes up and says, "Thank you for your service." And her parents had obviously put her up here. But I go, "Well, thank you. You're here to pay respects." And she goes, "Yes." And she says, "I have a flower." And she had one little flower. And she said, "I'm going to put it on one of the names." I get emotional. And I said, "That's very nice." And she said, "They deserve it." This 6-year-old girl who wasn't born 15 years after the attacks goes to that site and understands that those who died that day deserve our love. And that was what we wanted to accomplish, and I think we have.
It's beautiful. Alice?
Oh, I don't know how to follow that, honestly. I want to say 2 things. One is that I think it is remarkable that in Lower Manhattan, you have 16 acres of space. The river's on one side 2 blocks away, the other river's 3 blocks away. It is prime real estate. And you and Mike were able to achieve this magnificent intersection of commercial, transportation, retail, office space, now a performing arts center, redevelopment, the revitalized city. At the same time, preserving 8 acres of Lower Manhattan for memory and commemoration. It's an extraordinary thing that commemoration is at the heart of the renewal of this city, because I think it's essential. I don't think you can get to move forward unless you pay your respects to what happened there. So the fact that that was achieved on a political level and an economic level with all of the pressures is just simply something we should never take for granted. It is a huge commitment of this city and state to memory, which I think is just extraordinary. But I want to take one step from where you left off, Governor, and that is that it is 20 years. And 20 years is the span of a generation. And there are, it is estimated, 100 million people under the age of 25 who were born either after 9/11 in this country or were too young when the attacks happened to have a memory of what happened. Those people don't have that memory of the blue sky. And this is history to them. It's ancient history to some. And yet, where we're located, people have said ground zero is where the 21st century began. Well, this generation is going to become the custodians of the rest of the 21st century. And you cannot know where you are if you don't know where you've come from. So the burden on the museum right now, I believe, and on the memorial, is how we speak to this next generation about what happened. Because we are living in a very challenging moment. The world is fractured, this country is polarized, and it is the diametric opposite, and this came up before, of the way we responded in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. This city was a different place in those days. People hugged strangers on the street. Sonia Sotomayor spoke at the museum a few years ago, and there were a group of students in the auditorium. And she looked straight at them and said, "I'm not talking to anybody else, I'm talking to you." I love her, she's such a New Yorker. And she said, "You have any questions for me?" And somebody, of course, asked, "Well, what's your 9/11 story?" And of course, she's a New Yorker, and she said, "Well, my 9/11 story didn't happen on 9/11, it was the next day. And I was walking down the block in my neighborhood, and I saw somebody across the street, I didn't know that person, and she was weeping. So I went across the street and I hugged her. That's my 9/11 story." And that, to me, is the lesson we need to be teaching now to this generation, that you can actually meet adversity and recover. You can rebuild, but you have to do it with empathy and compassion and by being together with each other. And we are not there now. So I can't think of a more important legacy of this project, of this event, of this commitment to memory, and of paying respects to the lives that were taken so unjustly. The best thing we can do in tribute to your brother and your son is to remember the best of who we are as human beings and to try to live it every day.
Anthony, you've been very quiet during this panel.
Well, I'm moderating,
and,
Mary.
You're moderating.
I'm working here.
I just want to recognize Anthony. He was steadfast. He was determined. He was passionate.
He could be a pain in the neck.
I know a couple people like Governor Pataki used to run, but in fact, when we had the symposium, which we've had every year, he'd always be planning a rally on the corner. But I said, Anthony, I'm trying to calm things down for these families, but no, he would have a rally. But he learned single-handedly about Section 106. And he, I think, is totally responsible for the footprints of the building being preserved. He went on to go to school to learn museum studies. He worked at the New Jersey Museum and then worked at the 9/11 Memorial, which he was such an instrumental part of developing. So I just want to take a moment to recognize all of your work, Anthony, and your dedication, because you were instrumental.
Thank you. Thanks, Mary. Thank you.
And Anthony, you may have a new career here that we just
Did I do okay on my first try?
You did fine.
Sure, go ahead.
As 9/11 family members, who my husband lost 3 of his family, his brother and sister-in-law, and their first unborn child, we have always had a question about Fresh Kills landfill and the 40 acres that were used to sort and sift the rubble from the Trade Center. And that operation was cut short, and we know that there are still remains in that 40-acre area. We also know that Hickam Air Force Base had offered to excavate that area. Would have been easy for them to do to hopefully remove the remains that were still there. And we had taken on a real active role in back in those days with families for proper burial. But what we ended up with was, well, don't worry, there'll be a memorial at that 40-acre area. Well, I've been watching Fresh Kills Landfill Park and have not seen nor heard of anything in the way of a memorial to memorialize the people that we know are still there. Now, as you know, I did have some sort of a response from, you know, a canned response from Fresh Kills Park in 2020. Oh, don't worry. Well, to this day, I haven't heard a thing nor seen a thing on the Facebook page, the website, about what type of memorial will be planned for that 40-acre area, which is now supposedly capped and can't be excavated. Can someone please tell me what your vision is for that landfill, that 40-acre area of that landfill?
I think
he has never found one shred of his sister-in-law.
It's obviously a very, very important question. None of us on the panel, though, are in any position to be able to answer it, though. I don't know if that's more of a question
But
for
we
the
are
city.
in a position to give them grief over the fact that they haven't done it. And you are absolutely right that there should be some recognition, memorial, that remains of people who died on that horrible day are there. And Anthony's right. We can't make that happen, but we can certainly try. So
And we will be right there beside you.
I'm gonna give you my email. I'm gonna give you my email. I can certainly call and write people, whether or not I can't even pardon one of you if you commit a crime anymore, but I can at least
we're in trouble.
I can at least try to help out. And I just want to recognize Tara Snow, who for 20 years has been
Tara, stand up.
a great
Stand up,
liaison from my office and then as a private citizen.
Thank you, Governor. And so we're just about a minute over time, but I just want to just conclude with a couple of just quick thoughts. Governor Pataki, you started the discussion about reflecting on the fact that there was no model when we started this journey so many years ago. And what's interesting is over the years, as many of you know, so many other events that have happened, other acts of tragedy, events of tragic nature, those communities have turned to the 9/11 Memorial Museum and to the 9/11 community for guidance. Like in Orlando, the One Pulse Foundation. And the lessons learned here have been put into action there. They actually now have a national historic designation for some of the surviving remnants of the nightclub, which are being incorporated into the memorial. So our memorial here not only informs and engages the people that visit it, but it's had this impact and is viewed as a source of inspiration and guidance for these other communities that are now affected by similar adversity. So to Alice's point, one of the things that I thought was so important about this site, and I'm so grateful for in terms of what we ended up achieving, is I felt strongly that the authenticity of the site was preserved, that people would be able to connect to my brother and the people who died there. And that's ultimately what we were able to achieve through many, many years of effort. But it's something I take great comfort in because my brother Harvey loved our country. He was very interested in American history. And September 10th, the night before he was killed, he stayed up later than usual, to watch a documentary on World War II on the History Channel. And that was really out of character for him to stay up late because he left his house 5 a.m. every day to take that long ride in from the Jersey Shore to the World Trade Center site for his daily commute. But it was important enough for him to sacrifice that little bit of sleep that he had because it was history that he felt that he was a part of. And then hours later, he truly became a part of that history. And so it was one of the things that I never lost sight of. So I want to just again thank our panelists here and for all of your efforts over the years and your continued efforts and advocacy on behalf of the people we love and that we lost on 9/11 that stay in our hearts always. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great job.
Thank you. Thank you.